Certain relationships don't deliver a swift, decisive blow of destruction. Instead, they operate with a slow, insidious erosion, gradually persuading you that relinquishing pieces of your authentic self constitutes the necessary price for love, unwavering loyalty, or enduring family ties. Consequently, you remain tethered, attempting to reassure yourself that the situation isn't dire, that it merely represents a fleeting phase, and that you possess the fortitude to weather the storm. However, true strength doesn't reside in remaining steadfast amidst quiet decay, rather, it lies in summoning the courage to sever ties and embark on a new path. It's when your very soul begins to whisper the profound truth, this is no longer who you are destined to be. A unique form of exhaustion takes hold, one that evades the restorative power of sleep, a weariness born from the consistent suppression of your own needs, from the deliberate shrinking of your personal truth to accommodate another's comfort. Perhaps it manifests in the subtle act of editing your words before they escape your lips, or in the realization that your presence is merely tolerated, rather than genuinely valued. These are the hushed moments when your inner peace begins to hemorrhage, drop by precious drop, seeping into the widening fissures of a life that has become unrecognizable. The Stoics, those ancient philosophers of profound wisdom, didn't gauge peace by the fleeting measure of comfort. Instead, they assessed it through the lens of unclouded clarity. Epictetus, the renowned Stoic teacher, imparted the invaluable lesson that our suffering doesn't stem from the events themselves, but rather from our subjective judgment of them. Therefore, when your rational mind justifies dysfunctional patterns, when your heart tenaciously clings to individuals who dim your inner light, understand that this isn't love, it's fear masquerading as unwavering loyalty. And fear, as Seneca, another Stoic sage, so astutely warned, stands as the formidable adversary of wisdom. If this message resonates with a profound and unsettling truth within you, if it tugs at a reality you've been consciously avoiding, then rest assured, you're precisely where you need to be on your journey of self-discovery. Moreover, if the insights offered here help you perceive matters with greater lucidity or alleviate the burden of feeling isolated, I extend a simple, cost-free request: consider subscribing. Your subscription serves as the lifeblood that sustains this space, a sanctuary dedicated to honoring truth, safeguarding peace, and reminding you that walking away isn't tantamount to giving up, rather, it signifies a deliberate choice to embrace growth and transformation. Carl Jung, the eminent Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, posited that many of the relationships to which we cling aren't born from deliberate, conscious choice. Instead, they arise from deeply ingrained patterns we've never fully comprehended, unconscious repetitions echoing from the depths of our past, disguised as present-day realities. We may believe we're consciously choosing love, genuine friendship, or a sense of belonging, but in reality, we're often merely gravitating toward what feels familiar, rather than what nurtures our well-being and fosters genuine growth. That old acquaintance who consistently delivers backhanded compliments, or the romantic partner who withholds affection until you prove your worthiness, these aren't random occurrences, they're echoes of unhealed wounds, wounds we haven't yet identified, let alone begun to mend. Jung referred to this phenomenon as the psyche's earnest attempt at completion, a relentless effort to resolve unfinished emotional business by projecting it onto new roles and new faces. Consequently, we're not connecting from our highest, most authentic selves. Instead, we're unwittingly reenacting the unspoken traumas that have shaped our past. However, what transpires when you finally become cognizant of these recurring patterns? Do you muster the courage to walk away, or do you rationalize them away, minimizing their impact on your well-being? There's invariably a voice that interjects, offering excuses such as, "They didn't truly mean it," or, "Perhaps I'm being overly sensitive," or, "It's not always detrimental." Yet, the underlying truth remains: if someone consistently compels you to diminish yourself, to twist your values, or to harden your heart merely to maintain proximity to them, that supposed closeness is nothing more than a gilded cage. And this is precisely where Jung's concept of the shadow self unveils its brutal honesty. The individuals we tolerate, even when they inflict pain upon us, often serve as mirrors, reflecting the aspects of ourselves we haven't dared to confront. That emotionally distant partner, for instance, may awaken a familiar ache, the same longing for approval that haunted your childhood and never materialized. Similarly, that friend who perpetually criticizes you may embody the inner critic you've been desperately attempting to silence with external validation. We often mistakenly believe that we're being victimized by others, but in reality, it's frequently our own rejected aspects, our own buried truths, that are being triggered and brought to the surface. So, the pertinent question arises, why do we remain tethered to these detrimental relationships? The answer lies in the fact that confronting the shadow self feels infinitely more terrifying than assigning blame to someone else. It's far simpler to label them as toxic than to delve into the reasons why you tolerated their behavior in the first place. It's undeniably more comfortable to attempt to fix them than to confront the underlying needs within yourself that crave their approval. We instinctively hand others the mirror, because gazing directly at ourselves can feel akin to staring into an abyss, a void of uncertainty and self-doubt. However, what if we dared to pick up that mirror for ourselves? What if the very qualities that offend us most in others are, in fact, the qualities we've disowned within ourselves? Consequently, is leaving such relationships an act of weakness, or is it, in reality, an act of profound strength and self-preservation? The majority of us have been conditioned to believe that walking away equates to quitting, that letting go signifies failure. However, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, wisely reminded us, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. Therefore, if your daily thoughts are saturated with self-doubt, constant second-guessing, and the relentless need for emotional damage control, then your soul is gradually being dyed in a hue that doesn't align with your true essence. Walking away isn't about rejecting individuals, it's about vehemently refusing to abandon yourself any longer. It's about consciously choosing to unlearn the ingrained need for chaos and drama, it's about resolutely saying no to harmful reenactments of the past and emphatically saying yes to personal evolution and growth. But what transpires after the act of leaving? What does it truly entail to stand in the unsettling silence that follows such a momentous decision? In a world that often romanticizes endurance and perseverance, staying is frequently mistaken for genuine strength. We encounter this sentiment everywhere: ride it out, be loyal, don't give up on people. And while commitment undoubtedly holds its place, there exists a delicate line separating unwavering loyalty from self-betrayal. Certain relationships don't challenge us to expand and evolve, instead, they demand that we shrink and diminish ourselves. They don't welcome our full, authentic presence, rather, they necessitate our constant performance, a perpetual charade of meeting expectations. And yet, we remain tethered, firmly convinced that pushing through discomfort, regardless of its detrimental effects, constitutes a virtue in itself. But is it truly an act of strength if the only thing experiencing growth is your tolerance for pain and suffering? Enduring isn't synonymous with evolving. Carl Jung was unequivocal about this fundamental truth: genuine psychological growth, which he termed individuation, necessitates a deliberate break from the unconscious patterns and the false identities we've inherited from our past. It's not merely about discovering who you authentically are, it's equally about shedding everything you are not, the layers of inauthenticity that obscure your true self. And that shedding process often entails walking away from the very individuals, places, and personas that once provided a sense of safety and security, because safety isn't always synonymous with alignment. Sometimes, safety is merely a cage constructed from the remnants of your past, or an outdated version of yourself clinging desperately to an expired identity. And what is the ultimate cost of remaining in such a state? Your wholeness, your very essence. So, how do you discern when it's time to finally let go and embark on a new chapter? The Stoics, those ancient philosophers of wisdom, taught that the highest aspiration is to live in accordance with nature. Your nature, Marcus Aurelius penned, waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one. That clarity, that profound simplicity, that unwavering self-alignment, that constitutes true evolution. However, to achieve alignment, you must first acknowledge what is misaligned, That job that drains your vitality, that friend who subtly undermines your confidence, that relationship where your authentic truth goes unheard and unvalued. Jung warned that the longer we evade these inner tensions, the more likely they are to manifest through anxiety, debilitating depression, or compulsive behaviors. The soul doesn't remain silent indefinitely, it initially speaks in gentle whispers, but if ignored, it will eventually escalate to screams of distress. The inherent difficulty lies in the fact that leaving doesn't always present a heroic image. Sometimes, it's executed in profound silence, devoid of grand pronouncements or definitive closure, merely a quiet, resolute decision to cease betraying yourself. And this is precisely where the majority of individuals become ensnared, not in the physical act of walking away, but in the overwhelming guilt that inevitably follows, guilt for choosing your own peace and well-being, guilt for evolving beyond someone you once deeply loved, guilt for outgrowing a version of yourself that once served as a protective shield. However, isn't guilt often merely the lingering residue of an identity that is in the process of disintegrating? What if that guilt is simply the grief associated with the profound process of evolution? Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, wisely stated, "No man was ever wise by chance." Wisdom is painstakingly earned through solitude, profound reflection, and often through the experience of loss, losing the illusion of who you believed you were, losing the comforting embrace of the familiar, losing the deceptive notion that staying equates to succeeding. Jung firmly believed that whatever we don't consciously release will inevitably find insidious ways to sabotage us from the shadows, undermining our well-being and hindering our growth. Therefore, individuation demands more than passive endurance, it requires active separation from illusions, from the cacophony of noise, and from individuals who no longer meet you where you authentically are. Consequently, the question isn't whether you possess the strength to remain in a detrimental situation, the true question is, do you possess the bravery to depart, when staying signifies abandoning your true self? What would it entail to cease labeling it as loyalty, and instead acknowledge it for what it truly is, fear of the unknown, cleverly masked as unwavering devotion? Jung himself lived this profound truth. His rupture with Freud wasn't merely an academic disagreement, it was an existential imperative. Jung had to liberate himself from his mentor's ideology to discover and articulate his own unique voice. And it was by no means an easy endeavor. Freud was far more than a colleague, he was a father figure, a towering presence in the nascent world of psychoanalysis. However, remaining under his intellectual shadow would have inevitably meant suppressing the very insights Jung felt compelled to explore, the collective unconscious, archetypes, and the profound spiritual dimensions of the psyche. These weren't trivial disagreements, they represented entire paradigms that clashed and diverged. And yet, Jung understood that he couldn't evolve and fulfill his destiny without stepping away, so he made the courageous decision to do so. The rupture with Freud wasn't amicable or mutually agreed upon, it was profoundly devastating. Freud reportedly fainted during one of their final conversations, underscoring the depth of their psychological entanglement. However, from that painful split, something entirely new and transformative emerged. Jung's own arduous process of individuation necessitated that he relinquish the perceived safety of Freud's approval, venture into uncharted isolation, and risk being misunderstood by his peers. And through that profound aloneness, he meticulously crafted an entire framework that would later empower millions to better comprehend themselves. Analytical psychology didn't originate from a place of comfort, it arose from confrontation, not only with Freud's established ideas but also with Jung's own intricate inner world. This is precisely what rendered it so profoundly powerful. His theories weren't merely abstract concepts, they were vividly lived experiences. Therefore, the pertinent question becomes, what are you still clinging to because it once provided you with a sense of validation and recognition? And what possibilities might be awaiting you on the other side of your own personal rupture? Because rupture, though undeniably painful, often serves as the gateway to profound reinvention and transformation. It shatters the illusion of safety, it compels clarity, and in doing so, it clears the space for something truer and more authentic to emerge. The majority of individuals harbor a deep-seated fear of these moments of separation, not because they're inherently wrong, but because they challenge the very identity we've painstakingly constructed around someone else's acceptance. However, Seneca wisely wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it." And how much of your precious life have you spent contorting yourself, suppressing your own needs, merely to keep certain relationships intact? We may label it as loyalty or compromise, but deep within our hearts, we know when we're not being honest with ourselves. And we inevitably pay a price for that dishonesty. The cost may be subtle at first, a slight act of self-censorship, a minor emotional withdrawal, but over time, that cost becomes unbearable. You can feel it in your body, in your forced silence, in the agonizing dissonance between who you truly are and who you're pretending to be. This isn't a transient phase, it's your psyche desperately pleading for alignment, for congruence between your inner and outer worlds. Therefore, what if letting go is the most faithful act you can undertake, not to others, but to your own profound growth and evolution? Jung once proclaimed, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." That deliberate choice often commences in the aftermath of rupture, in the quiet, introspective space where old roles dissolve and a new self begins to take form, not instantaneously, but piece by piece, as you reclaim the vital energy you previously expended attempting to belong, attempting to fit into a mold that wasn't authentically yours. And belonging, in its truest essence, isn't about conforming or fitting in, it's about becoming so deeply grounded in your own unique truth that the right individuals, the right path, begin to organically gravitate toward you. However, before that clarity can fully emerge, there's invariably the initial chaos of letting go, the grief, the persistent second-guessing, the gnawing fear that you've committed a grave mistake, that you'll ultimately end up alone, that you'll forever regret the ensuing silence. But isn't it also entirely possible that what you'll discover within that silence is your own authentic voice, the voice that has been suppressed and unheard for far too long? And if you could finally hear yourself with unclouded clarity, what profound wisdom might you offer in return? Because walking away doesn't simply signify losing someone else, it often feels as though you're losing a part of yourself. The ego doesn't fear solitude nearly as much as it fears uncertainty, that unsettling question that lingers, who am I without them? It's not merely a rhetorical inquiry, it's an identity crisis, a profound rupture in the narrative you've meticulously constructed your life around. You're not solely letting go of a person, you're simultaneously letting go of the version of yourself that existed in conjunction with them. And when that identity has been reinforced by years of deeply ingrained habits, assigned roles, and persistent emotional patterns, it can feel akin to stepping into an abyss, a symbolic death preceding a rebirth. Carl Jung referred to this as the fear of the void, a psychological emptiness that confronts us when the structures we've tenaciously clung to begin to crumble and dissipate. However, here lies the inherent paradox. The very void we so desperately fear is often the precise space where our truest, most authentic self is patiently awaiting discovery. Why do we so frequently choose pain and suffering over the potential for profound possibility? Because we mistakenly conflate what feels familiar with what equates to genuine safety and well-being. It's a tragic deception perpetrated by the mind. The discomfort we know becomes a distorted form of comfort. It's predictable, it's meticulously mapped out, and the brain inherently favors patterns, even those that inflict pain. Seneca astutely wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." And that statement couldn't be more apt when it comes to the daunting prospect of letting go. We envision ourselves as shattered, irrevocably lost, incapable of rebuilding our lives anew. We project catastrophic consequences onto the experience of solitude. However, solitude, in its truest and most profound form, isn't abandonment, it's clarity, it's the shedding of the incessant noise, the pervasive distortion, the borrowed voices that have clouded our judgment. So, why does it still feel so excruciatingly unbearable? Is it truly love if it demands the sacrifice of your inner peace? Jung believed that the arduous journey toward wholeness necessitated the dismantling of false identities, not because those identities were inherently flawed, but because they were profoundly incomplete. He argued that we don't become who we are destined to be by accumulating more and more, but rather by deliberately subtracting what is not authentically ours, the attachments we tenaciously cling to, many of which are borrowed, inherited beliefs, imposed roles, and emotional debts passed down through generations. And until we summon the courage to step into the void and allow these inauthentic aspects to fall away, we'll remain trapped in repeating the same detrimental cycles, merely disguised in new forms. So then, what does genuine freedom truly entail? It's not a sudden surge of unwavering peace, nor is it a perfect, comprehensive understanding of who you are at your core. Rather, it's the unwavering willingness to sit in the unsettling silence without impulsively rushing to fill it, the unwavering courage to allow your identity to rebuild itself from the inside out, unburdened by the expectations of those around you. That space, raw, empty, and terrifying, is where the transformative process of individuation commences. It's where you cease performing for the benefit of others and begin the authentic process of becoming your true self. And in that profound quiet, when the incessant noise finally subsides, and there's no one left to impress or please, who do you finally encounter? Jung would argue that this is the soul's ultimate compromise. We trade our inherent authenticity for the fleeting illusion of belonging. We initiate this process by biting our tongue once or twice, dismissing it as inconsequential, but eventually, we reach a point where we no longer recognize our own voice. We shape-shift to maintain an artificial peace, we don masks to gain acceptance, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, we begin to vanish, not outwardly, but from within. And what vanishes isn't simply weakness, it's our vitality, our aliveness, our inherent truth. The Stoics cautioned us against this form of self-abandonment. Epictetus taught that it is not the external things themselves that disturb us, but rather our subjective opinions about them. And when our opinion of ourselves is constantly filtered through the distorted lens of what others might think, we lose our inner compass, we become emotionally dissonant, torn between the truth we feel and the carefully curated image we maintain. That dissonance isn't merely uncomfortable, it's profoundly corrosive. It gradually wears down your nervous system, it floods your thoughts, it seeps into your sleep, and eventually, your body begins to articulate the truth your mouth stubbornly refuses to acknowledge, manifesting in the form of anxiety, burnout, debilitating fatigue, and that peculiar heaviness in your chest that defies definition but feels akin to overwhelming grief. But what are you truly postponing by remaining in a situation that relentlessly chips away at your inner peace? Is it genuine love, or merely the paralyzing fear of being alone? Because there exists a profound distinction between the two, although in the throes of the moment, they can feel nearly indistinguishable. Love is expansive, it fosters your growth, it honors your evolving self. However, fear is restrictive, it clings possessively, it manipulates subtly, it whispers insidious lies that you'll be nothing without them. It convinces you that silence is safer than authentic self-expression, that discomfort is merely the inevitable cost of genuine connection. But what kind of connection necessitates that you lie to yourself merely to sustain it? Jung astutely understood that the majority of what we commonly refer to as attachment is simply a defense mechanism, the ego's desperate attempt to cling to the familiar to evade the terrifying void of the unknown. However, the inherent irony lies in the fact that the more tenaciously we cling, the emptier we become, and the more vehemently we pretend that everything is perfectly fine, the further we drift from our inner truth. Over time, this doesn't simply inflict pain, it hollows us out from the inside. So, is staying truly noble, or is it merely a fear of solitude cunningly disguised? Seneca once advised, associate with people who are likely to improve you. But how frequently do we engage in the opposite behavior? How often do we deliberately surround ourselves with individuals who keep us stagnant, frozen in place, merely because stagnation feels safer and more predictable than the daunting prospect of transformation? We tenaciously cling to relationships that no longer fit because they're intricately woven into the fabric of our identity, because the silence that follows their departure feels unbearable, because starting anew feels akin to abject failure. But what if staying is the real failure, the failure to listen to your inner wisdom, the failure to evolve and grow, the failure to choose courage over the perceived comfort of the familiar? What if being alone isn't the insurmountable danger we've been conditioned to believe it is? What if it's actually the very beginning of hearing your own authentic voice again, clearly, honestly, and without the pervasive distortion of external influences? And if you were to grant that voice a moment of your undivided attention, what profound wisdom might it impart? Solitude is one of the most profoundly misunderstood states of being. We're systematically conditioned to avoid it as though it were a contagious plague. We erroneously equate it with loneliness, with abandonment, with the terrifying possibility that we might not be sufficient on our own. We're taught that being alone signifies that something has gone terribly wrong, that someone has deliberately left, that we've somehow failed, that we've been rejected, forgotten, or deemed unworthy. However, Carl Jung perceived it through an entirely different lens. He firmly believed that solitude wasn't a form of punishment, it was, in fact, purification, a sacred space where distractions dissipate, and what remains is the unfiltered truth of who you are, unburdened by external noise and expectations. It's solely in solitude that we cease performing for an audience. There's no longer a need to adjust your tone to avoid conflict, no more rehearsing your emotions to conform to someone else's expectations. There are no roles to play when no one is watching, simply you, your unfiltered thoughts, and that quiet voice within, the voice that often gets drowned out in the cacophony of connection. And while that experience can initially feel terrifying, it's simultaneously liberating, because when the masks finally fall away, when the echo of others' opinions finally fades, you're presented with the profound opportunity to meet yourself in your rawest, most authentic form. Why do we so vehemently resist that transformative meeting? Because it compels us to confront the very aspects of ourselves we've diligently avoided, the grief we've buried beneath relentless busyness, the truth we've concealed with incessant people-pleasing, the desires we've sacrificed in exchange for fleeting acceptance. In the presence of others, it's relatively easy to distract ourselves from these uncomfortable truths, but in solitude, there's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the self. And yet, that stillness, that confrontation, is precisely where genuine transformation commences. Jung referred to it as individuation, the arduous process of becoming whole by integrating every facet of yourself, the conscious, the unconscious, the light, and the shadow. But that profound process doesn't unfold in a crowded room, it transpires in the crucible of solitude. The Stoics vehemently echoed this sentiment. Marcus Aurelius, an emperor constantly surrounded by advisors and burdened by immense pressure, still turned inward for guidance and solace. He wrote, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. The external world is loud, demanding, and saturated with conflicting opinions, but your inner world is where wisdom patiently awaits, where your intuition becomes honed and sharpened, where clarity begins to gradually form, not instantaneously, but like the gradual lifting of mist from a majestic mountain." Still, the initial quiet can feel almost unbearable. We're so accustomed to outsourcing our sense of self to relationships, achievements, and assigned roles that solitude can feel akin to profound emptiness. But what if that perceived emptiness isn't a void to be feared, but rather a space patiently awaiting to be filled by your own unique truth? What if solitude is less about absence and more about profound presence, the unwavering presence of your own unfiltered experience, the presence of your authentic self emerging from beneath the suffocating layers of performance and external expectation? And in that profound presence, something else begins to stir, a sense of inner peace that isn't contingent upon the approval of others, a clarity that isn't shaped by the cacophony of voices surrounding you, a strength that doesn't require external validation to exist. It's within this sacred space that we cease asking, "What do they think of me?" and begin asking the far more profound question, "What do I truly think of myself?" That fundamental shift is everything, because once you truly know who you are, unburdened by the noise of external opinions, no one can manipulate you with silence or emotional blackmail. But if solitude truly holds that kind of transformative power, then what becomes possible when you cease fearing being alone and begin embracing it as your most sacred ground? Because silence possesses the remarkable ability to amplify everything we've diligently worked to suppress. When the external noise finally subsides, the underlying pain becomes louder, the distractions fade away, the performances come to an end, and what remains is the stark truth, the bruised and wounded parts of you that you've silenced for the sake of keeping others comfortable. You begin to hear that small, persistent voice you've persistently ignored, the voice that whispered, "This isn't working," long before things actually began to unravel. And you realize, sometimes tragically too late, that what you've mistakenly labeled as love was simply a carefully disguised form of self-abandonment. You undeniably love them, but at the devastating cost of leaving yourself behind, a sacrifice that ultimately proves to be too great. That's the kind of profound realization that doesn't merely whisper, it roars with unyielding force. Carl Jung believed that individuals are capable of anything, regardless of how absurd or self-destructive, to avoid confronting their own souls. And relationships can often become one of the most socially acceptable means of achieving precisely that. You lose yourself within someone else's needs, their fleeting moods, and their relentless expectations, not because you're inherently generous, but because you're fundamentally scared of what you'll discover if you dare to stand alone and face your own inner landscape. Consequently, you sacrifice your own authentic voice to maintain a superficial harmony, failing to recognize that silence is often the loudest form of betrayal, the insidious betrayal of self. But pain, contrary to what we've been taught, isn't the enemy, it's invaluable information. It's the psyche's way of waving a red flag, desperately attempting to pull you out of the suffocating fog of denial. And denial is what keeps us trapped in detrimental cycles, not because we're inherently blind, but because we consciously choose not to see the truth that lies before us. Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, once proclaimed, "The unexamined life is not worth living." But meticulously examining your life, particularly your relationships, demands immense courage and unwavering honesty. It necessitates that you admit that you've been complicit in your own suffering, not because you deserved it, but because a part of you mistakenly believed that enduring it made you virtuous, somehow elevating your moral character. Isn't it peculiar how we sometimes confuse endurance with genuine integrity? We often mistakenly believe that remaining silent is noble, that suppressing our truth makes us stronger, but what if the very opposite is true? What if true strength lies in courageous confrontation, not primarily with others, but with the deepest recesses of ourselves? What if the pain you're currently experiencing isn't a sign that you're irreparably broken, but rather a signal that something vital within you is beginning to awaken? Plato, the renowned philosopher, believed that truth is the genesis of every good to the gods and of every good to humankind. And truth invariably begins when denial comes to an end, when you finally admit that something has been amiss for an extended period, that your fundamental needs are not being adequately met, that your joy feels manufactured and contrived, that the connection you've been so diligently protecting is draining you far more than it's nourishing you. The very instant you allow that underlying truth to surface, even if only in a tentative whisper, you reclaim a piece of yourself that has been lost, suppressed, or willingly surrendered. So, why do we still hesitate to speak our truth? Because confrontation inevitably carries the risk of rejection, the potential for discomfort, and the certainty of change, unsettling change. But Aristotle wisely reminded us, courage is the first of human qualities, because it is the quality which guarantees the others. And without unwavering courage, we remain ensnared in cycles we've long outgrown, tenaciously clinging to relationships that no longer even recognize who we're in the process of becoming. The Stoics understood that clarity emerges not through comfort but through the contrasting experience of discomfort. Epictetus taught that we must meticulously distinguish between what lies within our sphere of control and what remains beyond our influence. Speaking your truth is unequivocally within your control. Whether someone else is capable of meeting you there is not your burden to carry. Your sole responsibility is to cease silencing yourself for the sake of a peace that is inherently false, because genuine peace doesn't stem from pretending, it emanates from the unwavering embrace of truth. And if you were to allow yourself to articulate that truth, even just once, what profound healing might finally commence. So, what transpires when you finally do, when you cease making excuses for what no longer resonates with your authentic self, when you declare, quietly but with unyielding conviction, "This is no longer for me." And you don't utter those words with rage or resentment, but rather with unwavering clarity? That clarity doesn't always evoke feelings of empowerment initially, it often manifests as a profound sense of loss, because the moment you detach yourself, the world doesn't immediately applaud your decision. People may regard you with confusion or disappointment, some will label you as selfish, ungrateful, overly sensitive, or emotionally distant. And what's worse, a part of you might even begin to believe them, because you've grown accustomed to the chaos, it has insidiously become your normal. And walking away from what feels familiar, even when it's undeniably toxic, can leave you feeling disoriented and adrift. Peace isn't always inherently comfortable at first, in fact, it can feel unsettling, like standing in a room where the screaming has ceased, but the echo still lingers, a haunting reminder of the turmoil that once pervaded. That silence can be terrifying, but it's also profoundly sacred, because within it, you begin to discern something that has been drowned out for far too long, your own authentic voice. And this is where the true work begins. Walking away is merely the initial threshold. What inevitably follows is what Carl Jung famously termed the dark night of the soul. It's the descent, the emotional unraveling that transpires after you relinquish the version of yourself that was painstakingly constructed for the benefit of someone else. You grieve not only the individual you walked away from but also the identity you meticulously crafted around them, the ways in which you deliberately made yourself smaller, the assigned roles you dutifully played, and the dreams you silently suppressed. You begin to perceive with unclouded clarity the ways in which you actively abandoned your own becoming in exchange for fleeting acceptance and external validation. Plato once stated, "The first and greatest victory is to conquer yourself." And that's precisely what this transformative phase demands, because the moment you step into the realm of solitude, you encounter the very parts of yourself you've diligently avoided by remaining consistently busy, incessantly needed, or hopelessly entangled in codependent relationships. You realize the extent to which your self-worth was inextricably tied to someone else's fleeting validation. You recognize the pervasive projections, how the love you so generously gave was often a desperate plea for someone to reflect it back to you, merely so you could feel complete and whole again. And within that profound recognition, there's undeniably pain, but there's also something else, space, and space is everything, space to breathe deeply, to reflect introspectively, to consciously choose, not merely react, not simply survive, but to finally live authentically, on your own unwavering terms. This marks the beginning of self-sovereignty, the ability to construct your life from within, rather than relying on the capricious approval of others. The Stoics would aptly refer to this as the return to what lies within your sphere of control. As Epictetus wisely stated, freedom is the only worthy goal in life. The path to true victory, as the Stoics understood, is achieved by disregarding those matters that lie outside the realm of our control. Indeed, few things are as resistant to our influence as another person's perception of us. Therefore, it is imperative to focus on what we can influence, our own actions and responses. When confronted with the void left by a departure, a separation, or a letting go, what will you do? Will you hastily fill it with distractions, new noise, new acquaintances, new chaos? Or will you instead embrace the solitude, allowing yourself the necessary time to reconnect with your authentic self, the one that exists beneath the masks we wear for the world? Carl Jung, the renowned psychiatrist, profoundly believed that wholeness could only be achieved through the integration of both light and shadow, both strength and sorrow. This process of self-discovery is not about fixing perceived flaws, rather, it is about uncovering the true self that resides beneath the layers of roles, coping mechanisms, and conditioning. Imagine finally meeting that self, the one who feels no need to perform, explain, or apologize for their existence. What would it feel like to simply be? And from that foundational place of being, what kind of life could you ultimately construct? Jung famously said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This statement was not merely metaphorical, he intended it quite literally. When you remain unaware of the hidden wounds that are shaping your decisions, you invariably repeat the same painful storylines, mistakenly attributing them to destiny. Consider this: you might find yourself repeatedly dating the same type of person, only to wonder why the relationship always ends in the same disappointing manner. Or perhaps you habitually silence your voice in every room you enter, wrongly labeling it as humility. You might even pour your heart and soul into relationships with people who never fully see you, mistakenly convinced that it is love. However, none of these patterns are preordained by fate, they are simply the result of unconscious programming. Walking away, therefore, becomes an act of reclaiming your power, a way to begin rewriting your life from a place of awareness, rather than mere survival. It signifies a conscious decision to stop allowing your past to dictate your future. And then, something truly remarkable begins to unfold. Slowly, gently, without force, you cease searching for others to complete you. You begin to relinquish the deeply ingrained belief that you are somehow broken, that someone else holds the missing piece to your puzzle. You come to the profound realization that nothing is missing at all, there are only parts of yourself that you have been taught to conceal. As those hidden parts return home to you, the people around you begin to shift and change. This is not because you are altering your standards out of fear, but because your sense of self-worth is no longer negotiable. You stop craving external validation, reflected in the mirrors of others, and instead, you begin to embody the light yourself. And isn't that, ultimately, the whole point? We were never intended to remain stagnant. The universe does not reward stagnation, it celebrates growth. The Stoics held this understanding deeply within their philosophy. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, reminded himself daily that life is inherently about change, and resistance to change is, in essence, resistance to nature itself. When we stubbornly cling to that which no longer serves us, we are clinging to decay. And decay, it's crucial to recognize, is not loyalty, it's self-sabotage. Every relationship we have either aligns with our personal evolution or serves as an anchor, weighed down by nostalgia, guilt, or fear. So, how do you discern the difference between these two types of relationships? Pay close attention to how your soul feels after the conversation ends. Do not focus solely on what was said, or how you smiled, but rather on what your body did when you walked away. Did it shrink? Did it ache? Or did it breathe freely? That is your truth, and it is often quieter than the clamor of your rationalizations. But as Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, wisely stated, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And wisdom doesn't always come dressed in comfort. Sometimes, it manifests as saying goodbye, and sometimes it entails disappointing others in order to finally stop disappointing yourself. Cutting the rope that binds you to a detrimental situation is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of clarity. You are not abandoning them, you are returning to yourself. You are choosing to no longer carry a burden that was never yours to bear. In doing so, you create space for peace, for healing, and for alignment with your true purpose. Socrates, another towering figure in Greek philosophy, famously said, "The secret of change is to focus all your energy, not on fighting the old, but on building the new." Letting go, therefore, is not a war, it is a release. It is trusting that your worth is not determined by how long you endure a situation, but rather by how deeply you honor what is true for you in this present moment. So, when you feel the tension between who you have been and who you are becoming, what will you choose? Will you hold on out of habit and familiarity, or will you let go and finally grow into the self that has been waiting just beneath the weight of expectations? But how do you know when it is truly time to let go? You know it is time when you begin to feel like a guest in your own skin, when your presence becomes a performance for the benefit of others, when you walk away from conversations feeling not heard, but edited. It is subtle at first. You start meticulously monitoring your tone, avoiding certain truths, laughing on cue. But over time, this behavior becomes your default setting. You are no longer truly living, you are merely managing perceptions. And the most dangerous part of this charade? You might actually start believing that this carefully constructed version of yourself is real. Marcus Aurelius cautioned, "Never value anything as profitable to yourself that shall compel you to break your promise, lose your self-respect, or to hate any man." And yet, we do it daily. We break small promises to ourselves in a desperate attempt to maintain surface harmony. But that harmony always comes at a significant cost. When you wake up and realize that your life feels scripted instead of lived, that is not a sign of weakness, it is your inner self knocking, gently asking if you are finally ready to stop performing. It is time when you leave a conversation feeling smaller instead of seen, when every interaction becomes a tense negotiation between your truth and their comfort, when you begin to ask yourself, what version of me do they like best, instead of, who am I really? Aristotle, in his profound wisdom, once said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." But how can you possibly know yourself when you are constantly reshaping your identity to fit inside someone else's expectations? So, what do you do when you wake up and realize that you are not living, but merely enduring? That is the pivotal moment, the hinge, the turning point. And when it arrives, the choice is entirely yours. You can choose to stay and slowly erode into someone you no longer recognize, or you can choose to walk away and rise, not immediately, not effortlessly, but inevitably. Because the self that honors its truth will always find its way back home. Or you can walk away, not in anger, not in haste, but with clarity, with grace, and with the quiet understanding that walking away is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of a new chapter. And no, it will not be immediate, it will not be effortless. Healing rarely is. But it will be inevitable, because the self that honors its truth will always find its way back home, no matter how lost it has been. Plato, another giant of Greek philosophy, taught that, the measure of a man is what he does with power, and there is no greater personal power than choosing your peace over your ingrained patterns, choosing evolution over the comfort of familiarity, choosing your truth even when your voice shakes with fear. So, when that moment comes, when you feel the undeniable pull between comfort and your true calling, will you continue performing, or will you finally start living authentically? It is easy to forget that peace is not simply a feeling, it is a direction. It is not passive, it is not the mere absence of noise. It is something you must actively protect, diligently cultivate, and consciously choose every single day, especially in a world that often rewards chaos and mistakenly labels it as connection. We are constantly told to be accommodating, to keep relationships alive at any cost, to never give up on people, even when keeping them means slowly giving up on ourselves. But Marcus Aurelius wisely wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it." The adage, "If it is not true, do not say it," resonates deeply. To that, I would append a crucial addendum: if something doesn't cultivate inner peace, then don't remain within its confines, for your inner light possesses profound significance. It not only provides warmth to those around you but, more importantly, sustains your very existence. Should you consistently diminish yourself to fit into spaces that fail to acknowledge your inherent worth, your inner flame doesn't merely fade, it flickers erratically, shrouded in confusion and self-doubt. Conversely, when you conscientiously tend to that inner flame, when you nurture it, provide it with sustenance, and diligently guard it, it begins to grow, not to scorch or harm others, but to serve as a guiding beacon, keeping you grounded and steadfast amidst the darkness. Eventually, that inner flame will intensify, becoming bright enough to illuminate the path for others as well. This is the transformative essence of healing. It doesn't merely alter your individual self, it fundamentally reshapes the atmosphere that envelopes you. Therefore, I present this query to you, devoid of judgment and imbued with utmost honesty: who are you when unburdened by external influences? Not the version of yourself that has been contorted to satisfy the needs of others, not the version that has been diminished to avoid conflict, but the authentic you, the version you may have suppressed, the one who has always possessed an intrinsic understanding of what peace feels like, even if you were never granted permission to actively pursue it. And should you allow that authentic version to emerge, should you choose inner peace over the shackles of your past, what potential might you unlock? Have you ever confronted the necessity of making that profound choice, of severing ties with a relationship, relinquishing a role, or shedding a former version of yourself, simply to breathe freely once more? What did you unearth in that tranquil space, once the clamor of external voices had subsided? If you feel secure enough to share, please contribute your story in the comments section below. I assure you that there exists someone, somewhere, actively seeking the strength they may not yet realize they possess, and your narrative could serve as the catalyst that reminds them of what is possible. Furthermore, if this message has resonated within you, if it has assisted you in articulating a feeling you have carried in solitude or has provided you with the verbiage to make a decision you have been postponing, I encourage you to consider subscribing. We are cultivating a community here, firmly rooted in awareness, in courage, and in the type of profound wisdom exemplified by the Stoics, not boisterous, but enduring, not reactive, but resilient. And above all, remember this fundamental truth: choosing peace is not an act of selfishness, it is a sacred act. It is not an escape from the world or from others, it is a return to your truest self. I look forward to connecting with you in the next reflection.